2014. So we've got a lot of really exciting things over the next year.
Yeah, there's a lot of exciting things that will be coming out during that time frame over the next year that will definitely interest people. And I can relate to what you're saying about historical museums and things of that nature, because here in Durham we have the Pauline Murray Museum, which just recently opened. I think it opened like in the last year or two. But Pauline Murray was a activist. Some people wonder about her lifestyle choices because there's all kinds of rumors about what she may or may not have been. But that's part of the history that they are exploring. But I think that having the support of Duke University in terms of creating that Pauline Murray Museum has helped a lot. But you're right, it's in the middle of like a neighborhood that is not a part of the urban area of Durham, and it's kind of tucked away to the side. So I do know that some of those people that are organizing it are trying to find what you're talking about, history groups and school groups, and trying to get them to come to the center, and it's not exactly in a easy to get to place. So that is part of what they are trying to do, is create that model where they can maintain it as a historical house, since this is the house I believe that she was born at.
Yeah, and that's so important. Pauline Murray is such an important figure in history from so many standpoints, and as a scholar, as a woman, as a religious leader, just a person who made so many changes. And while it is a challenge with a business model, it is so important to have these symbols. We are getting ready to have a ceremony, a renaming of a block of 136th Street in Harlem as Madam C.J. Walker, Alelia Walker Place. It's on the block where their home and business used to be. That building has been torn down, but today it would never be torn down, but it was torn down. But just a street sign or a statue or a plaque, and certainly a house, I say you never underestimate the power that it has to inspire a child to raise the awareness of an ally and to challenge the ignorance of a bigot. Because when we have these tangible examples, you cannot deny that we exist.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And just out of curiosity, since you brought it up and everything, the importance of historical things and documents and historical monuments and things of that nature. As a historian yourself, as an activist yourself, what was your view when some of these things were being moved or taken off of their stand? They were in like Confederate areas like Durham and Chapel Hill, where they're still fighting over renaming and things of that nature. So I just wondered, as a historian.
Yeah, one of my high school friends is on the faculty at UNC, and she was right up there with the. I don't think she helped pull Silent Sam down, but she has been advocating for that for a really long time. I am trying to see many dimensions on this Confederate statue issue. And the thing that I know is that most of those statues went up long after the Civil War, and I'm sure you have done the reading too, but they really were the Daughters of the Confederacy about 50 years after the end of the Civil War were trying to burnish the image of the Civil War and make heroes out of people who really were traitors. And they raised the money 50 years later, and it was in the Jim Crow era to tell people to stay in their place. Then another set of those monuments went up during the Civil Rights Movement during the 1950s, again, to tell us to stay in our place. But they have convinced the people who believe that it's honoring their relatives and their great-grandparents who were traitors to the Union that they are heroes. And we now have to, because we are not honest with our history in America, we pretend that there was never any racism. We pretend that white supremacy was not the objective, and they still are arguing about the cause of the Civil War. So when I look at this, I think those statues don't need to be in a place where I have to look at them all the time, and that are common spaces. They can be moved to another place with context, or if they do stay in the place where they are now, there needs to be a Harriet Tubman or a Frederick Douglass or somebody else who is very nearby so that we get the full dimension of American history. Just my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you on that totally. And one of the other things that we talked about in this show before, actually we talked about it last week with one of our guests, and I was just wondering what you think about this, is that a lot of times in our school system also seems to be to some degree failing. You talked about the failing of history and learning about our historical icons, like your great-great-grandmother, like your namesake, and things of that nature. But then I also wonder if we're not failing in terms of teaching about what they were about. In other words, I don't know that enough of our schools are actually teaching about entrepreneurship or about financial literacy and things of that nature. So if Madam C.J. Walker was to all of a sudden appear in the 21st century and look at our school system and the way that we are dealing with entrepreneurship and financial leadership, what do you think her reaction would be to what's going on in the 21st century?
Yeah, well, I think her whole deal was people need to be educated. She provided scholarships for dozens of students because she hadn't really been able to have much formal education herself, and she believed in empowering people in economic independence. So if she could make the curriculum, I know that she would want to make sure that people are learning about entrepreneurship. But, I just think it's so complicated right now that when you think about history, there's a book that if you haven't already read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, or your audience has not read it, this talks about how black neighborhoods were redlined. Federal policy allowed banks, as you know, to not to give us loans. And so when neighborhoods were created and neighborhoods deteriorated, it was because of federal policy. When those neighborhoods deteriorated, that meant there were fewer resources for those schools. And so we are living this legacy of our poor schools in inner cities and why black children are not getting the same advantages. And now in reaction to Brown versus Board of Education, instead of integrating the schools, instead of us working together, the reaction was white people went over and created their own schools, and they really didn't want to be bothered. So that then made left fewer resources for the schools. So I think, and now we're at a point where everybody has to teach to the test, and teaching to the test is not teaching civics, is not teaching financial literacy, is not teaching many of the things that we need to survive and to thrive.
There's no doubt about that, and you're right about the redlining. And the other thing that was going on both in Durham as well as in Winston-Salem, as well as St. Louis and other places, was the whole concept of basically running the highways through our district as well. The highway system was not an accidental highway system. There was an intent in terms of where those highways were created and where they went to. So a lot of times they were literally rammed right through our neighborhoods that were rich in terms of being financial centers and financial capitals of our area. And then they made intentional decisions, and there were some people even in our own community that made some money off of those decisions because, in a lot of things, we have people that take the easy way out, and of course they try to find that easy money. So they might have meant that their families may still be having some of the benefits of that, but the bigger benefit to the community was that those communities were almost totally demolished.
You're right. I grew up in Indianapolis. It absolutely happened. The church that I went to was part of the, so-called urban renewal that just sent that freeway right through the center of town. I just saw a documentary a couple of nights ago about Little Rock. The same thing happened on 9th Street in Little Rock. And as you say, town after town after town, where the neighborhoods were thriving neighborhoods and loans were not made, and so then they could do eminent domain and condemn the houses because they intended for it to be that way. And, I hate for it to be, it's not a conspiracy theory to look at these neighborhoods and realize that the decisions that were made by the bankers, by the politicians, by people, the power structure, that they really didn't care about black neighborhoods, that there was an intentional effort to, it's certainly not to support them, if not to destroy them.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about that. Now, coming back to both of your relatives, as you were doing the research, what was the thing that just surprised you the most? I'm sure that as you were doing this research and looking at it, there was something that, as you were reading it and as you were doing the research and as you were studying it, you were like, now that's surprising to me. I did not expect it. So anytime I talk to people that are authors, particularly those that are doing historical books and things of that nature, there's usually at least 2 or 3 flashpoints where they're sitting there going okay, now that I was not expecting.
But, there were a lot of those moments. But I will say for Alelia Walker, I was, just really surprised at how much she traveled internationally. I mean, both women traveled, but A'Lelia Walker went in 1921 and 22 to Paris, London, Monte Carlo, Rome for the coronation of the Pope, Cairo, Addis Ababa, where she met the Ethiopian Empress, and she traveled to South America, she traveled to Cuba, all over the United States. So the sense of how mobile African Americans were in the early 20th century, I think at that point 90% of African Americans lived in the South and most in the rural South. So we think of people as sort of being stuck. But there were a lot of people who were moving around, and in some ways, today, it was a lot of the entertainers who were some of the most mobile and who had some of the most money. But that was a revelation for me, and also Madam Walker's political radicalism. She was very outspoken about the rights of black soldiers. She supported black soldiers becoming officers during World War I, which was resisted. But then when they were coming back, she got into public arguments with some of their, supposed white friends who said basically black people should stay in their place. And she said, no, we are not going to do that. And so they were, unhappy with her. But I loved that she spoke up. She even did, I will tell you the final thing that surprised me. She and Ida B. Wells Barnett and Marcus Garvey were spied upon by a black spy, a guy who worked for the War Department, who wrote up a report and called them Negro subversives because they were speaking out for civil rights, and that made me love her even more.
So that actually brings up an interesting point, because I know that some of those other people during that era were accused of being part of the early Red Scare. So was there any time that he was actually being hounded by, say, the FBI or some of those agencies and being accused of being involved in the early developments of, say, socialism or communism? Because I know that we think of that more as like an issue in the later times, the 40s and the 50s, but there were people even in the early 1900s that were facing that issue and everything. So I was wondering if he had to deal with that at all.
Yeah, well, some, because when she died in 1919, women didn't have the right to vote, but she certainly was, supportive of political people. And A. Philip Randolph, who, of course, was, accused of being a socialist and who we know was the leader in organizing the March on Washington, he was definitely a socialist. His wife, Lucille Green Randolph, was a hairdresser very close to Madam Walker, and president of the New York Club for Walker Agents. She later ran as a socialist. So Madam Walker saw some value to those ideas. She advertised in the Messenger. The other thing is that at the end of the war, there were a number of African Americans who wanted to travel to France to observe the peace talks, and Madam Walker applied for a passport, and she and a number of African Americans were denied passports by the State Department because Woodrow Wilson's administration did not want them on the international stage talking about racism.
And just out of curiosity, now Madam Walker was also around in the same era as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Where do you think she would have put in their whole discussion? Because, they were on two opposite ends of the spectrum, but do you have a friendship with either one of them, or did she ally with either one of them? But where did she fall into that conversation? And also, did she know Marcus Garvey? Did she have any thoughts of where his philosophy was at that time?
She knew all three of them, as well as A. Philip Randolph and Monroe Trotters, and Ida B. Wells and Mary McLeod Bethune, and that was another thing that was surprising to me. They sort of all knew each other. And, it was interesting. It's more complicated than we want it to be, because we get into this dichotomy of Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois. At one point, as you know, they interacted with each other. But Madam Walker interacted with both, and she found what she could support in each of them. With Booker T. Washington, she admired the fact that he had built an institution, that he had built Tuskegee, that he wielded a certain amount of political influence. He was the most powerful black man in America from about, after Frederick Douglass's death in 1895 until his death in 1915. And Madam Walker knew that about his power, and she was supportive of some of the things